In 1957, Dr. Margaret Hensley submitted what would become her final academic paper to the University of Edinburgh's Department of Folklore Studies. The thesis, titled Narrative Corruption in Oral Tradition, a Study of Deviant Fairy Tale Variants, was archived immediately upon submission and never published. The university cited concerns over the disturbing nature of the collected material, though official records suggest the decision came from higher administrative levels. Dr. Hensley disappeared 3 weeks after her thesis defense, leaving behind only her research notes and a collection of audio recordings that would remain sealed for over a decade. The research had begun innocently enough. In 1954, Dr. Hensley received a grant to document traditional fairy tales as told in remote communities across Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and northern England. Her methodology was straightforward: visit isolated villages, record oral storytelling sessions, and analyze variations from the standard Brothers Grimm and Charles Perrault collections. What she discovered, however, defied every academic expectation. The first anomaly emerged in the village of Kirkmuirhill, South Lanarkshire, during the autumn of 1954. Eleanor McBride, a 73-year-old widow, agreed to share the stories her grandmother had told her as a child. The session began, conventionally enough, with a version of Little Red Riding Hood. But McBride's telling contained elements that made Dr. Hensley's hands shake as she transcribed the recording weeks later. In McBride's version, the grandmother never returned. The wolf consumed her entirely, bones and all, leaving only her nightgown hanging in the wardrobe. The little girl, upon discovering this, did not scream or run. Instead, according to McBride's matter-of-fact delivery, the child simply began setting the table for one less person every evening. The story ended there, with no woodsman, no rescue, no moral lesson, just a child learning to live with absence. Dr. Hensley initially attributed the variation to the harsh realities of rural life, where death was more immediate and fairy tale happy endings seemed frivolous. She continued her research, travelling next to the village of Glenarm in County Antrim, Northern Ireland. There, Thomas Kelly, an 81-year-old retired fisherman, shared his grandmother's version of Hansel and Gretel. Kelly's telling began familiar enough. 2 children abandoned in the forest by parents who could no longer feed them, but the gingerbread house in his version was not made of candy and sweets. It was constructed from compressed ash and bone meal, painted to look appetizing in the dim forest light. The witch did not fatten the children to eat them. Instead, she kept them in a state of perpetual hunger, feeding them just enough to maintain consciousness while slowly removing pieces of them that would not be immediately missed. A fingernail here, a lock of hair there, small sections of skin from areas typically covered by clothing. According to Kelly's telling, the children never escaped. They became part of the house itself, their voices joining a chorus that lured other lost children. The story concluded with the detail that made Dr. Hensley pause her recording equipment. Kelly mentioned that his grandmother always ended this tale by checking that all the children in the room still had all their fingers and toes. She would count them aloud, he said, with tears in her eyes. The pattern became undeniable as Dr. Hensley's research continued. In every remote community she visited, the traditional fairy tales had been corrupted into something far more sinister. These were not simple regional variations or cultural adaptations. These stories shared a darkness that suggested a common source, yet Dr. Hensley could find no historical record of where these versions had originated. In the Welsh village of Llangnwyd, nestled in the hills of Bridgeon County, she encountered Mary Williams, a 67-year-old former schoolteacher. Williams shared a version of Cinderella that haunted Dr. Hensley for months afterward. In this telling, Cinderella's step-family did not simply treat her as a servant. They gradually erased her existence entirely. First, They removed her name from family records. Then they stopped acknowledging her presence even when she was directly in front of them. The fairy godmother figure was not a magical benefactor, but rather Cinderella's own deteriorating grip on reality as she began to believe she was, in fact, invisible. The prince in William's version never saw Cinderella at the ball because she had never actually attended. She had spent those nights scrubbing floors in an empty ballroom, dancing alone with shadows while believing herself to be in the company of nobility. The glass slipper that supposedly fit only her foot was found to fit no one at all because it had been crafted from her own imagination. The story ended with Cinderella's complete disappearance from the world, leaving no trace that she had ever existed. Williams told this story in the same gentle tone one might use to describe a pleasant afternoon, occasionally pausing to sip tea. When Dr. Hensley asked about the story's origin, Williams replied that it had been passed down through 4 generations of women in her family. Each woman, she noted, had told it exactly as her mother had told it to her, changing not a single word. By the winter of 1955, Dr. Hensley had collected 47 such variants. Each story maintained the basic structure of its familiar counterpart, but had been twisted into something that defied conventional understanding of how folklore evolved. Traditional stories typically became sanitized over time, especially when told to children. These versions had moved in the opposite direction, becoming progressively darker and more psychologically complex. Dr. Hensley's notes from this period reveal her growing obsession with finding the source of these corrupted tales. She theorized that a single storyteller, perhaps decades or even centuries earlier, had deliberately crafted these variants and somehow spread them across multiple isolated communities. But the logistics of such dissemination seemed impossible given the geographic spread and the historically limited travel between these remote areas. Her research took an unexpected turn in the spring of 1956 when she visited the village of Little Stretton in Shropshire, England. There, she met with the Pemberton family. Robert Pemberton, age 49, his wife Dorothy, age 46, and their 3 children. The family had maintained an oral tradition of fairy tale telling that spanned 7 generations. The Pembertons' version of Sleeping Beauty contained elements that made Dr. Hensley question everything she thought she understood about folklore transmission. In their telling, the princess did not fall into an enchanted sleep after pricking her finger on a spinning wheel. Instead, she experienced what they called the Long Awakening, a state where she remained fully conscious but unable to move or speak while still aware of everything happening around her. The prince, who eventually found her, did not wake her with a kiss. He simply began visiting regularly, speaking to her motionless form, telling her about the outside world that continued without her. Years passed in this manner. The princess aged normally while trapped in her paralyzed state, watching her youth fade in the reflection of the prince's eyes as he grew older alongside her. According to the Pemberton version, the princess never truly woke up. Instead, she learned to move again gradually over many years, but retained the memory of every moment of her paralysis. The story concluded with the detail that the princess never slept naturally again, instead spending her nights lying motionless by choice, listening to the sounds of the castle and wondering which of her family members might someday experience their own long awakening. And Robert Pemberton mentioned that his great-great-grandmother had insisted that this story be told exactly as received, with no modifications. She had claimed that changing even a single detail would somehow make the story more real than it should be. When Dr. Hensley asked what this meant, Pemberton could only repeat what had been passed down to him, that some stories were told not to entertain but to remember, and that forgetting them completely would be more dangerous than telling them forever. The implications of this statement troubled Dr. Hensley deeply. Her notes from June 1956 indicate that she had begun to suspect these stories were not simply folklore variants, but rather accounts of actual events that had been preserved in the form of fairy tales. The idea seemed impossible, yet the consistency of certain details across geographically isolated communities suggested something more than coincidence. Her investigation intensified during the summer of 1956 when she travelled to the Scottish Highlands, specifically to the village of Kinloch Rannoch in Perth and Kinross. There, she interviewed Hamish MacLeod, an 85-year-old retired shepherd who had spent his entire life in the region. MacLeod shared a version of Snow White that differed significantly from any Dr. D. Hensley had previously encountered. In MacLeod's telling, Snow White was not a princess, but rather a young woman from the village who had been born with a condition that made her skin appear unusually pale. The seven dwarfs were not magical creatures, but rather a group of men who worked in the local mines and had developed severe spinal curvatures from years of laboring in cramped conditions. They offered Snow White shelter not out of kindness, but because they needed someone to maintain their remote cabin while they worked underground for weeks at a time. The poisoned apple in MacLeod's version was not given by an evil stepmother, but rather was a piece of fruit that had grown in contaminated soil near the mine. Snow White's apparent death was actually a coma caused by the toxins in the fruit. She remained unconscious in the miner's cabin for several months while they continued their work below ground, unaware that she was not actually dead. According to MacLeod, Snow White eventually awakened on her own, but the prolonged exposure to the toxins had affected her mind. She could no longer remember her life before arriving at the cabin and believed herself to be a different person entirely. The miners, returning from their extended work period, found her in this confused state and decided to care for her permanently rather than return her to a village where she might not be recognized or accepted. MacLeod's grandmother had known the actual miners who inspired this story. She had described them as kind men who had lived with Snow White until each died of lung complications related to their work. Snow White had outlived them all, eventually becoming a hermit in the abandoned cabin until her own death many decades later. Local records from the 1800s supported elements of this account, including documentation of several mine workers and a woman of unknown origin who had been found living alone in the hills. The discovery of this historical correlation marked a turning point in Dr. Hensley's research. She began searching for documentation that might support other stories in her collection, focusing on parish records, local newspapers, and court documents from the 18th and 19th centuries. What she found disturbed her more than any of the stories themselves. In the archives of the Carmarthen County Record Office in Wales, she discovered an 1834 coroner's report describing the death of a young woman whose circumstances matched perfectly with the Cinderella variant she had collected. The woman, identified only as Sarah, had been found dead in the ballroom of an abandoned manor house. Her body showed signs of severe malnutrition and exhaustion. Most disturbing, her feet had been severely damaged, as if she had been dancing for extended periods without proper footwear. The report noted that Sarah had been wearing a dress made from curtain fabric and shoes crafted from glass fragments held together with wire. Local residents reported that she had been seen entering the manor house each evening for several weeks before her death, always alone, always carrying cleaning supplies. The coroner concluded that Sarah had been suffering from what he termed a disorder of the mind that caused her to believe she was attending social gatherings that existed only in her imagination. Similar documentation emerged for other stories. Court records from County Antrim described the disappearance of 2 children whose circumstances matched the Hansel and Gretel variant. Medical reports from Shropshire documented a young woman who had suffered from a rare neurological condition that left her in a conscious but paralyzed state for several years, matching the Sleeping Beauty story Dr. Hensley had collected. The pattern was undeniable. These fairy tale variants were not folklore at all, but rather oral histories of actual events that had been preserved and passed down through generations. The fantastic elements of traditional fairy tales had been stripped away, leaving only the harsh realities that had inspired them. Dr. Hensley realized she was not studying literature, but rather a form of collective memory that preserved traumatic events through the familiar structure of children's stories. Her research notes from late 1956 reveal her growing concern about the implications of her discovery. If these stories documented real events, then their preservation suggested that similar tragedies had occurred regularly across rural communities for generations. The storytellers were not entertaining children, but rather ensuring that the memory of these events was never lost. Dr. Hensley's investigation took on new urgency as she began to understand that the corrupted fairy tales served as warnings disguised as entertainment. Each story contained specific details that suggested ways to recognize similar situations in real life. The versions of Little Red Riding Hood warned about predators who disguised their intentions. The Hansel and Gretel variants described the signs of people who preyed on vulnerable children. The Sleeping Beauty stories documented the experience of victims who were aware but unable to defend themselves. By early 1957, Dr. Hensley had expanded her research to include contemporary cases. She began corresponding with social workers, police officers, and medical professionals in the regions where she had collected stories. What she discovered was that incidents matching the fairy tale variants continued to occur, though they were often dismissed as isolated tragedies rather than part of a larger pattern. A social worker in Lanarkshire reported 3 cases in the past decade of children who had been found living alone after their guardians had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The children's accounts of their abandonment matched elements of the corrupted fairy tales almost exactly. A police constable in County Antrim had investigated several disappearances of children near remote houses where strange odours had been reported by neighbours. Medical professionals in Wales documented cases of young women who suffered from severe dissociative episodes, believing themselves to be invisible or forgotten by their families. Dr. Hensley's final research notes, dated February 1957, contain her most disturbing conclusion. The fairy tale variants were not simply preserving the memory of past events, but were actively predicting future ones. The stories had evolved to include details that served as a form of early warning system, allowing communities to recognize dangerous patterns before they resulted in tragedy. Her thesis submission included recommendations for what she termed preventive intervention, based on the warning signs documented in the oral traditions. She proposed that social services agencies be trained to recognize the specific circumstances described in the corrupted fairy tales as indicators of potential abuse or exploitation. She suggested that the stories themselves be studied as a form of community wisdom that could help prevent future tragedies. The university's rejection of her thesis came with a note stating that her conclusions were incompatible with accepted academic standards, and that her research methods had crossed ethical boundaries by linking folklore to contemporary criminal activity. Dr. Hensley's faculty advisor later told colleagues that her work had been deemed too dangerous for publication, though the specific nature of this danger was never clarified in official records. 3 weeks after her thesis defense, Dr. Hensley failed to appear for a scheduled lecture at the university. Her apartment was found exactly as she had left it, with no signs of struggle or hurried departure. Her research materials remained on her desk, including a final note written in her handwriting that read, "The stories are true, because someone made them true. The telling continues because the events continue. I must find where it began. University officials reported Dr. Hensley's disappearance to local police, but the investigation was cursory. Her colleagues later noted that the inquiry seemed to focus more on her mental state than on potential foul play. The official conclusion was that Dr. Hensley had suffered a psychological breakdown brought on by her intensive research into disturbing subject matter and had likely left the area voluntarily to seek treatment elsewhere. Her research materials were sealed by university order and transferred to a restricted archive. The audio recordings she had made during her interviews were reportedly damaged during transfer and became unplayable. The transcripts of these recordings were filed separately and subsequently lost during a routine reorganization of the archives in 1962. However, copies of some transcripts had been made by Dr. Hensley's research assistant, James Crawford, who had been excluded from the official investigation. Crawford maintained his own files on the project and continued to follow similar cases on an informal basis. His records, discovered after his death in 1968, provided the only surviving documentation of Dr. Hensley's final conclusions. According to Crawford's notes, Dr. Hensley had identified what she believed to be a pattern in the geographic distribution of the corrupted fairy tales. The stories appeared to radiate outward from specific central points, suggesting that they had originated in particular locations and spread to surrounding communities through deliberate dissemination rather than natural folklore evolution. Crawford's files included maps that Dr. Hensley had created showing the spread patterns of different story variants. These maps indicated that each corrupted fairy tale had originated from a different geographic center, but that all centers were located near sites with specific characteristics, isolated manor houses or large estates that had been abandoned during the late 18th or early 19th centuries. Dr. Hensley had planned to investigate these central locations during the summer of 1957, but her disappearance prevented this phase of her research. Crawford's notes suggest that she had already identified several potential sites and had arranged to visit them with local guides who were familiar with the property's histories. The first site on her list was Blackwood Manor in Dumfries and Galloway, Scotland. This estate had been abandoned in 1842 after the deaths of its final residents, a family named Morrison. Local records indicated that the family had lived in isolation at the manor for several generations, rarely interacting with nearby communities except to hire occasional servants who typically left their employment after very brief periods. Parish records showed that the Morrison family had maintained an extensive library and had been known to collect folklore and local stories. Neighbors reported that they often hosted evening gatherings where storytelling was the primary entertainment. These events had been attended by residents from surrounding villages until approximately 1835, when the gatherings apparently ceased and the family withdrew completely from contact with outsiders. The Morrison family's deaths were attributed to a house fire that consumed most of the manor's interior. However, Crawford's files included a copy of a letter written by the local constable who had investigated the incident. The letter, addressed to his superior in Dumfries, described several disturbing aspects of the scene that had not been included in the official report. According to the constable's letter, the fire had burned in a pattern that seemed deliberately controlled, destroying specific rooms while leaving others untouched. The library had been completely consumed, but the servants' quarters remained intact. Most disturbing, the constable reported finding evidence that the library had been emptied of books before the fire began. The shelving units contained only ash, but the quantity of ash was insufficient to account for the number of books the library was known to have contained. The constable also noted that local residents had reported seeing lights in the manor's windows for several days after the fire, despite the fact that the building was supposed to be uninhabitable. When questioned about these reports, villagers became evasive and claimed they must have been mistaken. The constable's letter expressed his suspicion that the fire had been deliberately set and that valuable items had been removed from the manor before its destruction. Dr. Hensley's research had led her to believe that the Morrison family had been responsible for creating and disseminating the corrupted fairy tale variants. Her theory, as documented in Crawford's files, was that the family had systematically collected traditional stories and modified them to document real events that had occurred at their estate or in surrounding areas. These modified stories had then been spread to local communities through the storytelling gatherings held at the manor. The second site on Dr. Hensley's investigation list was Thornfield Hall in County Durham, England. This estate had been abandoned in 1837 after the disappearance of its owner, Charles Whitmore. Whitmore had been known as an eccentric collector of manuscripts and folklore who had maintained extensive correspondence with scholars and storytellers throughout northern England and Scotland. Local records indicated that Whitmore had employed several residents from nearby villages as domestic servants and research assistants. These employees had described their work as involving the documentation and preservation of local stories and traditions. However, most of Whitmore's employees had left his service abruptly, often without collecting their final wages or providing explanations for their departures. Whitmore's disappearance coincided with reports of strange activities at Thornfield Hall. Neighbors described seeing unusual lights and hearing voices coming from the estate at all hours of the night. Local children began reporting encounters with adults who told them stories that frightened them and instructed them to remember specific details that seemed unrelated to the tales being told. A police investigation into Whitmore's disappearance revealed that he had been conducting what he called experimental storytelling sessions with local children. Parents who had allowed their children to participate described these sessions as educational opportunities where their children would learn traditional stories and be compensated with small amounts of money or food. However, parents began withdrawing their children from these sessions after the children started exhibiting strange behaviors. Several children developed sleep disorders, experiencing nightmares that incorporated elements from the stories they had heard at Thornfield Hall. Others began telling their own versions of familiar fairy tales that contained disturbing details their parents were certain they had not heard elsewhere. The police investigation concluded that Whitmore had left the area voluntarily, possibly to avoid questions about his storytelling sessions. However, Thornfield Hall was never properly secured, and valuable items remained in the house for several years after Whitmore's disappearance. Local residents eventually began removing these items, claiming that Whitmore owed them money for services or supplies. Dr. Hensley's theory regarding Thornfield Hall was that Whitmore had been testing the effectiveness of storytelling as a method of psychological manipulation. Crawford's files included notes suggesting that Dr. Hensley believed Whitmore had been deliberately traumatizing children through modified fairy tales in order to study the long-term effects of early psychological conditioning. The third major site in Dr. Hensley's investigation was Ravens Hollow Estate in Pembrokeshire, Wales. This property had been associated with the Cadwallader family for over 2 centuries before being abandoned in 1845. The family had a documented history of mental illness, with several members having been committed to private sanitariums during the early 1800s. The final member of the Cadwallader family, Helena Cadwallader, had lived alone at Ravens Hollow for 15 years before her death in 1845. During this period, she had become known in the local community as an expert in traditional Welsh folklore and had been consulted by residents seeking advice about local customs and traditions. Helena Cadwallader had also been known to provide medical treatments using traditional remedies passed down through her family. Many residents credited her with successful treatments for various ailments, particularly those affecting children. She had maintained detailed records of her treatments and had insisted that patients' families provide her with detailed accounts of their family histories and local traditions in exchange for her medical services. After Helena Cadwallader's death, her estate was found to contain an extensive collection of documents detailing the medical and social histories of families throughout Pembrokeshire. These documents included not only medical information, but also detailed accounts of family tragedies, local crimes, and social scandals spanning several decades. Most significantly, the estate contained multiple versions of traditional fairy tales that had been annotated with specific details about real families and events. These annotations suggested that Helena Cadwallader had been using fairy tales as a method of preserving and organizing information about traumatic events in the local community. Crawford's files indicate that Dr. Hensley believed Helena Cadwallader had been blackmailing local families by threatening to reveal their secrets through storytelling sessions disguised as cultural preservation. The modified fairy tales served as coded references to specific events that could be understood by those familiar with local history, but would appear harmless to outsiders. Dr. Hensley's investigation had revealed a pattern connecting the three estates. All three properties had been owned by individuals who collected folklore. All three had been sites of regular storytelling sessions attended by local residents, and all three had been abandoned under suspicious circumstances during the 1830s and 1840s. Most significantly, the geographic distribution of the corrupted fairy tale variants corresponded exactly with the areas surrounding these three estates. The stories appeared to have spread outward from each property through the networks of people who had attended storytelling sessions or had been employed by the estate owners. Crawford's files included a letter that Dr. Hensley had written but apparently never sent, addressed to the University of Edinburgh's administration. In this letter, she described her conclusion that the three estate owners had been part of a deliberate conspiracy to create and disseminate the corrupted fairy tales as a form of social control. According to Dr. Hensley's theory, the conspiracy members had used storytelling as a method of preserving information about local tragedies and scandals in a form that could be transmitted across generations without appearing to be factual accounts. This allowed them to maintain detailed records of community secrets while avoiding legal consequences for their knowledge of potentially criminal activities. The letter also suggested that the conspiracy members had used their knowledge to manipulate local communities, using the threat of public revelation to control the behavior of families whose secrets they possessed. The fairy tale format allowed them to hint at specific knowledge without making direct accusations that could result in legal action. Dr. Hensley's final conclusion, as documented in the unsent letter, was that the corrupted fairy tales represented a sophisticated system of community surveillance and control that had operated for several decades across multiple regions. The system had been designed to appear benign while serving as an effective method of gathering, preserving, and weaponizing sensitive information about vulnerable individuals and families. The letter ended with Dr. Hensley's statement that she intended to visit the three estate sites to search for additional evidence of the conspiracy's activities. She expressed her belief that physical evidence might still exist at these locations, hidden in areas that had not been thoroughly searched after the estate's abandonment. Crawford's files contain no record of what Dr. Hensley might have discovered during her planned visits to the estates. Her disappearance occurred before she could complete this phase of her investigation, and no evidence was ever found to suggest that she had actually visited any of the three properties. However, Crawford had continued to monitor activities at the estate sites on an informal basis following Dr. Hensley's disappearance. His records indicate that all three properties experienced unusual incidents during the years immediately following her investigation. Blackwood Manor was purchased by a private collector in 1958, but the new owner abandoned the property within 6 months of beginning restoration work. The collector reported that workers had discovered sealed rooms in the manor's basement that contained disturbing materials, including what appeared to be preserved human remains and detailed documentation of medical experiments conducted on unwilling subjects. Thornfield Hall was demolished in 1959 after local authorities determined that the building had become structurally unsound. However, residents of nearby villages reported that the demolition crews had discovered underground chambers that had not been identified in previous surveys of the property. These chambers allegedly contained evidence of activities that prompted police involvement, though no official reports of this investigation were ever released. Ravenshollow Estate was acquired by the Welsh Government in 1961 for use as a historical preservation site. However, the property was never opened to the public after restoration workers reported finding extensive documentation hidden throughout the building. This documentation allegedly included detailed medical records of experiments conducted on local residents, including children, during the early 1800s. Crawford's files end abruptly in 1968 with a note indicating that he had been contacted by government officials who instructed him to cease his informal investigation and destroy all materials related to Dr. Hensley's research. Crawford apparently complied with these instructions, but not before creating copies of selected documents that were hidden at his residence. These surviving documents were discovered by Crawford's nephew, David Crawford, following James Crawford's death from natural causes in 1968. David Crawford, an archivist working for the National Library of Scotland, recognized the potential historical significance of his uncle's files and preserved them in a private collection. The documents remained in David Crawford's possession until his retirement in 1993, when he donated them to a small regional historical society in the Scottish borders. The Historical Society's limited resources meant that the documents were simply stored without detailed cataloguing or analysis. In 1998, a graduate student conducting research on regional folklore traditions discovered Crawford's files among the Historical Society's uncatalogued materials. The student, Margaret Sinclair, was working on a thesis about the evolution of oral traditions in border communities and recognized the potential importance of Dr. Hensley's research. Sinclair's analysis of Crawford's files confirmed many of Dr. Hensley's conclusions about the geographic distribution of corrupted fairy tale variants. However, Sinclair's research also revealed that similar story variants had been documented in other regions of the United Kingdom, suggesting that the conspiracy Dr. Hensley had identified might have been part of a larger phenomenon. Most significantly, Sinclair's research indicated that corrupted fairy tale variants continued to emerge in various communities throughout the late 20th century. These modern variants maintained the same pattern of realistic horror disguised as traditional folklore, suggesting that the underlying mechanisms identified by Dr. Hensley remained active decades after her investigation. Sinclair's thesis, completed in 2000, was accepted by her university but was never published due to concerns about its potential impact on the communities described in her research. University administrators cited the need to protect the privacy of individuals whose family histories were referenced in the oral traditions Sinclair had documented. However, Sinclair's research had attracted the attention of social workers and law enforcement professionals who recognized the potential value of Dr. Hensley's original conclusions about using folklore variants as early warning indicators of abuse and exploitation. Several pilot programs were established to train child protection workers to recognize the warning signs documented in corrupted fairy tale traditions. These programs achieved limited success, but their effectiveness was compromised by the reluctance of community members to discuss folklore traditions with outside authorities. Many residents of areas where corrupted fairy tales had been documented viewed these stories as private family matters that should not be shared with strangers, regardless of their professional credentials. The most significant development in understanding Dr. Hensley's research occurred in 2003, when renovation work at the University of Edinburgh's library led to the discovery of her original audio recordings. The recordings had been misfiled and forgotten rather than deliberately destroyed, and advances in audio restoration technology made it possible to recover most of the content that had been considered permanently lost. Analysis of the recovered recordings revealed aspects of Dr. Hensley's investigation that had not been documented in Crawford's files. Most importantly, the recordings included interviews with elderly residents who had been children during the periods when the three estates were actively conducting storytelling sessions. These interviews provided detailed accounts of the actual experiences of children who had attended sessions at Blackwood Manor, Thornfield Hall, and Ravens Hollow Estate. The accounts confirmed Dr. Hensley's suspicions about the true nature of these gatherings and provided evidence of systematic psychological manipulation disguised as cultural education. Children who had attended sessions at Blackwood Manor described being required to participate in what they were told were traditional games and activities. However, these activities appeared to have been designed to test the children's responses to various forms of psychological stress. Children were isolated from their peers, subjected to frightening visual displays, and required to repeat specific phrases and stories until they could recite them perfectly. Most disturbing, former attendees reported that they had been required to provide detailed information about their families and home situations in exchange for small rewards. This information gathering had been presented as part of learning about local traditions and customs, but the questioning had focused specifically on family secrets, financial problems, and evidence of criminal activity. Similar patterns were documented at Thornfield Hall and Ravens Hollow Estate. All three locations had used storytelling sessions as cover for systematic information gathering and psychological conditioning of local children. The corrupted fairy tales had served as both tools for psychological manipulation and methods for encoding and preserving the information gathered during these sessions. The recovered recordings also revealed that Dr. Hensley had identified additional estate properties that appeared to have been part of the same conspiracy. Her investigation had been more extensive than Crawford's files had indicated, encompassing potential sites in Ireland, northern France, and the Netherlands. Dr. Hensley's recorded notes described her belief that the conspiracy represented an early form of organized psychological research conducted by wealthy individuals who were interested in developing methods of social control. The fairy tale format had been chosen because it provided a socially acceptable framework for accessing and manipulating children while avoiding suspicion from parents and community leaders. Most significantly, the recordings revealed that Dr. Hensley had discovered evidence linking the estate owners to academic and medical institutions throughout Europe. Her research suggested that the storytelling sessions had been part of larger experiments in social psychology and behavioral modification that had been conducted with the knowledge and support of prominent scholars and physicians. This aspect of the conspiracy explained why Dr. Hensley's research had been suppressed so effectively. The individuals and institutions involved in the original experiments retained sufficient influence to prevent public disclosure of their activities even decades after the events had occurred. The recordings also contained Dr. Hensley's final theory about the ultimate purpose of the corrupted fairy tales. She believed that the stories had been designed not only to preserve information about past experiments, but also to serve as instructions for future researchers who might wish to continue similar work. The specific details preserved in each story variant provided a blueprint for identifying vulnerable individuals and families within isolated communities. The stories also demonstrated effective techniques for gaining access to children and establishing psychological control over them. In essence, the corrupted fairy tales served as training materials disguised as harmless folklore. This conclusion explained why new variants of corrupted fairy tales continued to emerge in different communities throughout the 20th century. The stories themselves had become a method of transmitting knowledge about psychological manipulation techniques across generations and geographic regions. Dr. Hensley's final recording, made just days before her disappearance, contained her most disturbing discovery. She had found evidence that several of the individuals responsible for creating the original corrupted fairy tales had established foundations and charitable organizations that continued to operate throughout the 20th century. These organizations maintained their founders' interest in folklore research and child welfare programs, but their activities appeared to perpetuate the same patterns of information gathering and psychological manipulation that had characterized the original storytelling sessions. The corrupted fairy tales served as recruitment tools, helping these organizations identify communities where their methods might be successfully implemented. Dr. Hensley's investigation had revealed that the conspiracy she had uncovered was not a historical curiosity, but an ongoing phenomenon that had adapted to changing social conditions while maintaining its core objectives. The individuals involved had simply become more sophisticated in their methods, using legitimate institutions as cover for activities that remained fundamentally unchanged from their 18th century origins. Her final recording ended with Dr. Hensley's statement that she intended to confront representatives of several organizations she suspected of continuing the conspiracy's work. She believed that direct confrontation was the only method of forcing public acknowledgement of their activities and ending their influence on vulnerable communities. No record exists of any such confrontations taking place, and Dr. Hensley's disappearance occurred within days of making this recording. The circumstances of her disappearance remain unexplained, and no evidence has ever been found to indicate what became of her, or whether she succeeded in contacting any of the organizations she had identified. The recovery of Dr. Hensley's recordings prompted renewed interest in her research among academics and social workers. However, attempts to investigate the organizations she had identified encountered the same obstacles that had prevented her own research from being published. Institutional resistance, legal challenges, and sudden funding cuts effectively prevented any significant follow-up investigation. The most recent development in the case occurred in 2007, when several communities in Scotland and northern England reported the emergence of new, corrupted fairy tale variants that had begun circulating among local children. These stories maintained the same pattern of realistic horror disguised as traditional folklore, suggesting that the mechanisms Dr. Hensley had identified remained active more than 50 years after her investigation. Local authorities were provided with copies of Dr. Hensley's research and recordings, but official responses varied significantly between jurisdictions. Some areas implemented monitoring programs based on Dr. Hensley's recommendations, while others dismissed the information as academic speculation without practical relevance to contemporary child protection efforts. The effectiveness of these monitoring programs remains unclear, as participating agencies have been reluctant to share detailed information about their methods or results. However, Unofficial reports suggest that several potential abuse situations have been identified through recognition of warning signs documented in corrupted fairy tale traditions. The continuing emergence of new story variants indicates that the underlying phenomenon Dr. Hensley investigated has not been eliminated. Whether this represents the ongoing activity of organized groups or simply the natural evolution of oral traditions in response to contemporary social conditions remains a subject of debate among the few researchers who have access to her work. What remains certain is that Dr. Hensley's investigation revealed a sophisticated and persistent system for exploiting vulnerable individuals through the manipulation of cultural traditions. Her disappearance prevented the complete exposure of this system, and the suppression of her research ensured that its methods could continue to be employed by those who understood their effectiveness. The corrupted fairy tales continue to circulate in isolated communities, carrying their coded warnings and instructions across generations. They serve as reminders that the greatest horrors often hide behind familiar faces and trusted institutions, disguised as entertainment, education, or cultural preservation. Dr. Hensley's final legacy lies not in the academic recognition she never received, but in the possibility that her research might still protect future generations from those who would exploit their innocence. Her recordings and notes remain available to those who know how to find them, offering hope that her sacrifice might not have been entirely in vain. The stories she documented continue to be told, but now they serve a different purpose. Instead of concealing truth behind fiction, they preserve the memory of one woman's courage in confronting forces that most people prefer not to acknowledge. In the end, perhaps that is the most important fairy tale of all. The story of someone who refused to accept that evil could hide forever behind the mask of harmless tradition. And in the shadows of remote communities, where old stories are still told by firelight and ancient traditions are preserved in whispered voices, Dr. Margaret Hensley's true story has become part of the oral tradition. It serves as a warning to future researchers about the dangers of uncovering certain truths, and as a promise that some secrets are too important to remain hidden forever. The fairy tales continue, but now they include her voice among the chorus of those who refuse to let important truths be forgotten. In this way, she achieved the immortality that she had sought for the victims whose stories she had tried to preserve. Their voices live on in the tales that warn of dangers that still exist, in forms that may have changed but whose essential nature remains the same.